So I just want to say a few words. Number one is I want to thank you all for coming today, and I want to thank you all for being members of this organization. That's our lifeblood. That keeps us going. And it's really important. And of course, there's a lot more members who aren't here today, but there's a large organization that goes throughout Lake Forest. I greatly appreciate that. Preservation Foundation greatly appreciates that, and that keeps us alive. Number two, I want to thank all of you. I want to thank our board of directors. We heard from people that have spoken so far today. We're in good physical condition. We've had some wonderful programs. We have a great communication system. We've had some wonderful newsletters go out. They're informative, they're educational, they're well done, they're professional, and I think everyone appreciates those. And I also want to thank the programs for that. The membership drive we had, you just heard from Suzanne that we've increased our membership, and that's a lot of work. You know, you spend 100 and you get one back, and that's the way that works as far as effort. So there's a lot of volunteer effort that keeps this organization going. So I'm president for 6 more minutes, and I just want to say it's been a lot of fun. We focused the last 2 years, and even prior to that, predominantly on the train station. You'll see activity on that this year. As you recall, we raised $50,000, and we took $50,000 out of our treasury. We paid a professional historical architect to come in and give us a study of the train station, what should be done to restore it to its original condition, essentially. That's somewhat the Bible of what we're going to be following generally. We continue to work with the city. We've helped the city write a grant, and they've raised over $1.2 million. They have over $1.2 million at this moment to spend on the train station, so that work will begin. And it's our hope that the train station will be returned to where it was 100 years ago, so that's the intention. I've had a great time. You won't see me anymore in front of this group as president, maybe as some other lesser position in the organization. But I want to thank you all for coming today, and I hope you enjoy our program. Thanks very much.
Today we have 2 of our stalwarts. We have Susan Benjamin and Art Miller speaking. What could be better than that? I mean, they're so well known and so knowledgeable, and they are giving. We have been asked to give a program and a tour by the city to celebrate its 150th. So we did that, and they happened to want it in April, and we said that's fine. It's going to be a little chilly out there, but at least we have sun today, right? It could have been yesterday. So with that, I'm going to have Susan come up and do her speech first, her presentation, and they figured out how they want to split it up, so I'm going to turn this over to Susan Benjamin, who's basically going through the entire historic district right now, studying and remapping, and you have to be careful about Susan here because she just damaged her leg, and so she's I'm fine.
What we're doing, Lake Forest Landmark District on the east side was done in the 1970s, and it's woefully skimpy. And so we are under a grant from the Illinois Historic Preservation Agency. We are updating the National Register nomination with the help of Sally and Art and people at the city, and everyone is pitching in to create something that we can all be proud of. And we are also updating Suzanne German's wonderful survey that she did in 1998, including new photographs of each building in the historic district. So we're pretty far along. We're about, maybe 50–75% done, and we should finish it within the next handful of months, and look forward to sharing information on that with you too when the time comes. Anyway, today I was thinking, what did I want to do to provide you with information and background on the buildings that you will be visiting? Art is the guru. He knows all the details about everything. I always say, you plug him in and then you get all this wonderful information. But I think I'm going to give you some background on the underpinnings of the plan for Lake Forest and the architecture of the specific houses that you will be seeing. Starting with this plan that Almarin, I can never pronounce that, Hotchkiss did in the 1850s and 1857, which interestingly enough was the same year that Olmsted and Vaux laid out Central Park. Al Hotchkiss was a cemetery designer. He was from St. Louis. He designed Bellefontaine Cemetery, a rural cemetery, garden cemeteries. They're sometimes referred to as our cemetery, laid out in the 1860s, is a garden cemetery. He designed, I can never pronounce this either, Chipianic Cemetery in Rock Island, which I've been to and is another very cool place. These garden cemeteries, which were, the first one was in Boston, Mount Auburn in 1831, were kind of the background to this picturesque romantic plan for Lake Forest, made up of curving roads through winding ravines. On 1,200 acres, the houses were laid out on 3 to 5 acre plots, and it was done at the same time as Olmsted and Vaux had won the competition to design Central Park. It was a time when the city was becoming crowded and congested, and people looked, believe it or not, for relief in the cemeteries. That's where they would go to find green space. So he designed the 893 acres that became Central Park. And this was at the same time. Now the communities that we are pretty familiar with, that we tend to identify as the first, or maybe not the first, but very early picturesque suburbs, are Riverside, Illinois, which is 1,600 acres on the Des Plaines River, laid out with curvilinear roads like Lake Forest. But look at the date, it's 1869, it's 12 years later. It was laid out by Olmsted and Vaux. And Highland Park was laid out by Cleveland and French, again, over 10 years later. Cleveland and French went on to design the city of Minneapolis, which, if you are familiar with, has these beautiful curvilinear streets too. There were some suburbs, some railroad suburbs that preceded Lake Forest, but I'm going to quote Art, that Lake Forest was the first large-scale romantic suburb to be realized in America. And I've been reading about this from, you know, the beginnings that he described in Great Estates and some other information that shows there were other smaller communities, but none of the scale and the size of Lake Forest. An early one was Llewellyn Park that was laid out in West Orange, New Jersey by Llewellyn S. Haskell. 12 miles from New York City, it was a commuter suburb laid out on 500 acres with twisting roads surrounding a large park. But it was not of the scale of Lake Forest, and today there are 173 homes. I'll give you an idea, and it's more of a gated community within a larger town. The architect was Andrew Jackson Downing, and you can see, I love this picture because Lake Forest is a park, basically, and these wonderful winding roads that wend their way through Lake Forest with homes sprinkled about in park-like settings is very characteristic of these garden communities, these picturesque communities, but Lake Forest today is a whole large city looking like a park. Next. Alexander Jackson Davis was the architect who laid out Llewellyn Park. At the same time, we're going to see how this, up here, he had a house for himself and also a home for Haskell as part of this development. But you can see it's a development, more like a subdivision than a whole city like Lake Forest. And he was a pharmaceutical merchant. He was looking for a place to live, build a country house in an area where it was beautiful and quiet and clean, away from the noise and tumult of New York City. And when this subdivision was laid out, there were 5 to 10 acre plots, and the homes that were built along it were called, at that time, villas by the men who built them like Davis. Alexander Jackson Davis, in 1831, wrote a book, Rural Residences. It was the first pattern book that had illustrations, engravings of residences, and it featured homes in either Gothic Revival or the Italianate style. So you see houses with towers and sort of a horizontal form that echoed the Italian villas in the Tuscan countryside. His most famous residence is Lyndhurst in Tarrytown, New York. Gothic Revival with its pointed arches, and it has rose windows and crenellations and all characteristics that you would associate with Gothic Revival architecture. It is a National Historic Landmark and open to the public, and really a beautiful place to visit along the Hudson. These houses that Davis laid out were meant to be situated in park-like settings, so that when you visit the homes today and you see how they're laid out, it was part of the vision of Davis and Andrew Jackson Downing. The book that Davis wrote with Downing was called Cottage Residences in 1842. I should tell you that Davis was a practicing architect, whereas Downing was a landscape architect, and I believe that there's only one house extant that he built. And they collaborated on this very early book that was incredibly influential. It featured residences. It was a pattern book where builders and carpenters and contractors could look at these homes and then model the houses that they build in their own communities after the designs of Downing and Davis. Downing has been called America's first landscape architect. He was a horticulturist. He was editor of Horticulture Magazine. He was a nurseryman, and he was an advocate for these Gothic Revival and Italianate houses that were built throughout the picturesque landscapes that he designed. He died very young, whereas Alexander Davis lived longer. And this is another one of the books he wrote, The Architecture of Country Houses. This was his own house in the Catskills in Newburgh, New York. Again, it's a Gothic Revival house set in a picturesque landscape, such as you would have seen, for instance, in paintings like the 17th century painting by Claude Lorraine. The homes that were preferable to these gentlemen who were architects and landscape architects like Downing and Davis were Gothic and Italianate. And the Gothic houses, such as the one on your left, and this is an illustration from the book by Downing, shows, you know, they were gable-roofed residences with picturesque details. They were irregularly shaped, nestled into the landscape. And what he envisioned were fairly, these picturesque houses in a bold landscape. They were houses with broad overhangs and detailing that made them very comfortable in this rather romantic setting. I think it's pretty interesting that these houses are comparable to what was being built in Chicago at the same time. And we know of Chicago that the motto for Chicago is Urbs und Horthof, which is city and a garden. And the homes that were built both on the north side and the west side occupied full city blocks. And if you can see, like here, you know, they were set in these picturesque landscapes. Many of them had greenhouses. And the men who lived there, like William Ogden, were gentlemen gardeners themselves and valued the surrounding landscape. So this was very much part of the kind of the gestalt, the thinking of this time period. I think this is particularly interesting. This is the Cardinal's house. It was built in 1885, and it is a remaining example where you can see, now the landscape has been changed over the years, but you can see a house and a garden on a half a block, on a substantial parcel of property, because, you know, the others don't exist anymore. And the first Archbishop of the city of Chicago, loved landscape, loved gardening, and he hired Horace Cleveland of Cleveland and French, who was they were the runner-ups, by the way, for the design for Central Park, but they designed Minneapolis and Highland Park, and so he had designed for the church residence of the Archbishop of the city of Chicago, a city and a house in a garden. The homes themselves were villas, and Carter Harrison's house was built on the west side in 1858. It was at a time when there was nothing. It was on open prairie, and there was nothing between his home and the downtown business district of the city of Chicago. George Rumsey's house was on the north side. I love this because it's the only image I have ever found of a before and after of the Chicago fire. But so you can see what happened. I hope you can see these. It was hard to do this, and the room has this glorious light today. It's kind of the good news and the bad news. It's wonderful and beautiful, and we're going to have a great day for a tour, but it's kind of hard to see slides. Anyway, these were, I'm going to show you examples of what Italianate architecture looks like, or the characteristics of it. But this Harrison's house with a tower, broad overhangs, paired brackets, tall narrow windows, arched with arched tops. And here is another example, similar but on the north side, contemporary with what we're going to see today. The Italianate style, what are the characteristics? There are two basic types of Italianate architecture, and you're going to see both types today. One is more symmetrical and one is more picturesque. They are typified by, some of them have cupolas, some of them have tall arched windows, some segmental arch. The Holt house has segmental arches, not a full arch window. Brackets, broad overhangs, very similar to the Villa Lante outside Rome. It is quite amazing that you can see exactly where this indeed came from. I really wanted to show you this image too, because we all know the Glessner House at 1800 South Prairie, this wonderful Richardsonian Romanesque home. But what people don't often see is the house that the Glessners lived in on the west side before they moved into 1800 South Prairie. And there you have, you couldn't have a more typical, even if a lot more simplified than the houses you're going to see, example of Italianate architecture. The Thompson House is an example of the more this, by the way, I have a reprint of Downing's book, and that's what these are taken from. Here's a more picturesque type of Italianate architecture with a bell tower and an irregular footprint, and that is what the Thompson House is characteristic of, with this very sort of exotic tower. Another style that was popular at the same time as Italianate architecture is the Second Empire style. It was a little more elaborate, it was a little more statuesque, and it was a style that was favored by Marshall Field or George Pullman. You can see here's a mansard, a Second Empire. Many of the early houses on Prairie Avenue were Second Empire style. This is where the movers and shakers of Chicago lived. This was a style that they preferred in the 1870s. The David Lake House was characteristic of the Second Empire style, and its most defining feature, of course, is the mansard roof. And sometimes the style is called Second Empire, sometimes it's called mansard. It takes its name from Francois Mansart, who designed the Louvre in the 17th century, but the style was popularized under Napoleon III, hence it's being called the Second Empire style. Napoleon III built buildings throughout Paris with mansard roofs to gain an extra floor of rentable space. That's kind of a tax dodge, In any case, the Lake House, and I think this is an interesting piece of this whole puzzle of architecture. Houses evolve, they change over time, they bear the imprint of different residents who lived there. So originally it looked like this with the mansard roof and a very stately tower. As time went on, the home acquired other stylistic characteristics that are very much part of its significance and its character. So you will see it has kind of an irregular Queen Anne footprint and porches. And when I mention the word porch, Downing felt the porches on these early houses were very important because they were the link between the residents of the house and nature. And this is an important piece of his philosophy. He also believed, by the way, that there was a deep undercurrent of moralism in the philosophy behind these houses, that people who drove by would, in their carriages, would become better people through exposure to the architecture of these early houses, and the people who lived in them would become better people by virtue of living in these houses. But the homes change over time, and the changes that you see, whether they're addition of porches, whether they're kind of colonial characteristics, are all significant and important in defining what the home is all about. And these are the houses that you're going to see, and Art is going to tell you a little bit more about. They are examples of the more symmetrical type of Italianate, the more picturesque type, mansard, Second Empire type. I'm leaving this to Art because I think he knows a lot more about it than I do. But nevertheless, they are all homes that are very much part of the beautiful fabric of Lake Forest, set in this wonderful park-like setting that very much defines the character of the community. Thank you. Where's my pal? I'm passing the baton. Ta-da.
Well, this is just another view. I'm going to talk about the four houses very briefly. This was the regular house, and the regular house was built for the person who was the stable, regular, wide, square, sitting down, centered person. D.R. Holt, lumber business, excellent person. And so what you can see, there's a little irregular part down here in the back. This is looking at it from the south, and there were outbuildings that weren't so regular. So it was regular in front. When you go to this house, the Kriegers have kept the house very much like this. It's an example of a 19th century interior. It probably shows a couple different stages. 1860 when the house was built, and then the library that we're looking at right here from a contemporary picture is probably done a little bit later, probably in the 80s, I would say, the 1880s, but it's all 19th century. And you'll notice there's a certain darkness to it. It's dark. So that will contrast with, there's a thing where you can just put it to click. Okay. Well, moving along. All right, next one. Now this one is to show, this is in line, looking from the Presbyterian Church grounds to the south, looking south to them. Here's the regular house, here's the irregular house. So here the houses are in line. Now we heard about the moral character. We understand the moral character of the guy who lives in the square house. I'm not sure exactly all the symbolism of the 19th century houses, but let's have the next slide, which shows this house more close up. I don't think they'd all studied Freudian psychology in the 19th century. This would have a different connotation today than it did then. But this was supposed to be the more picturesque kind of setting, and it was picturesque. It had irregular landscape down into the base of the ravine. It was a much more free-spirited person's house. Now, we had two mayors who lived there. Joseph Durand was the second one. The first one was Harvey Thompson. So I'm trying to think of what those free-spirit mayors must have done during their administrations. It could have been pretty interesting. But you can see a typical urn. This is a picture that was done in the 1970s by local artist Vic Turner. and this was a Historical Society card. It also shows that the windows, right up in here, have been replaced already by the 80s, and I think probably earlier than that. They're no longer rounded at the top, but they're straight across. So even artwork can give you useful information. Okay, this shows this irregular landscape, and we actually have a book that shows that there was this developed terrace down there. And if you stand at the Presbyterian Church today and look into the ravine, you can still see this terrace, which was very Italianate in character. Okay, now this definitely has the element that is the Second Empire, and this would be the next one. This is the D.J. Lake House of 1870. D.J. Lake was one of the very first people involved in Lake Forest. He was the secretary of the Lake Forest Association, which means he was in on the decisions to buy the property, lay out the property, which was a big deal, sell shares, turn the shares into lots, all within a couple of years. And by 1861, there was a whole New England village here, actually a city, by 1861. So he was in the real estate business. He had an urchin who had a buddy that went to the academy across the street at that time, where Durand Institute is now. And they printed the first newspaper in town, the Lake Forest Gem. And a lot of what we know about the people in that period comes from this little paper that the kids did, including it had a great railroad schedule and everything. You can see what it was like. But this house this is kind of an English Gothic revival toward that kind of a feature. This is Italianate. This is French. This is kind of like today, people who want a little of everything in their house. So we have to remember that this was the period of the Gilded Age, and this house was definitely gilded. And so it got simplified as time went by a little bit, but it had all kinds of characteristics. Later, Rose Farwell Chatfield Taylor lived there with her husband, Hobart Chatfield Taylor, and so it was a high-style house well through the 20th century and into the present. Okay, this is a dark interior. This isn't going to help us any. Can't see it from back there. Just take my word for it. There's a cove ceiling right here, and you're going to see a cove ceiling inside that D.J. Lake house. And it probably was at one time painted with some kind of a mural. This is a picture from the Driehaus Museum. Anybody been to the Driehaus Museum downtown, 1880s? It's well worth a trip. It's really amazingly, it's a good show of what late 19th century architecture interiors were like. Very different than what happened a few years later. Okay, this is just looking across the street from that house. You would have seen this house. This is an Italianate house that's gone now, but it was the Bradley House, 1867. So this is something else that was in the neighborhood, and that's in those same kind of styles. You can see the rounded windows, which I think you'll see later on your trip. Now this isn't a house. This is for the fourth house. You got the picture of the house at 725 North Sheridan. This is A.B. Dick. The reason, and this is him in the early days of Lake Forest Hospital. He married Helen Aldrich. The house that you're going to is the Aldrich House. It's also colorfully discussed in a little thing that Evelyn McCutcheon did in 1907. She wrote up a memoir of a weekend at New Year's where she's courting, or they're courting each other, and Helen Aldrich gets her book Toboggan from what they call Junior, or A.B. Dick Jr. And this is Vic Turner again, his interpretation of that slide at the Winter Club, which dumped the people out on the other side of the street in the Nicastro's front yard. So he was a gentleman, lent her his toboggan, and they were sledding forever on. This is now, to contrast, this is a little introduction. This house is also gone. It's the vacant lot just across the street here to the north of Glenrowan, where we're going to go. This is the Lilacs, built in 1872, torn down in 1871. It was stick style, and the sticks were pretty much gone. It was pretty much crumbling by that time. It was a wonderful house with all these different characteristics also. Just another view of it, but look at all the things sticking out in every direction, okay? Now, this is the interior, And notice there's an ingle nook. This is too dark to be seen. But there's an ingle nook with seats on either side, a fireplace, screens, and a stairway. You're going to see some of these same features at Glen Rowan because that was the second generation of that same family. The Reed family, the Simon Somerville Reed, big grocer in Chicago, wholesale grocer, Monarch Foods. Now this is Glen Rowan, taken probably in the middle of the 20th century. And one of the things that's sad is to see all the trees that are in front of the house. They're gone. Here, you see this is more late 20th century. The lawn is looking great. The trees are gone. You see it's got also something almost like mansard roofs up here, but it's more English traditional style, asymmetrical, very much a-traditional. This shows that there is, in that plan, there's an outside garden room right here, a terrace, which is the garden club and the college are cooperating with Craig Bergman, who's very generously helping to restore the terrace and the pool with Fernando. And you'll have a look at that space, which is one of the longest, it is, I think, the longest formal garden feature like this to survive with a reflecting pool that's been operating all the time. Ragdale has a small pool that's been there since 1905, but I think he reserved a more fancy one for his customer in 1909 for this house, which was completed in 1909. Okay, now, Shaw doesn't usually have porte cocheres on his house. Why is there a porte cochere on Glen Rowan? It's across the street from here. This money came from the Reed family that lived at the Lilacs. The building next door came from the Reed family. The dorms over there got money. It was partly paid by someone else, but they contributed money toward it. And so he echoed, it's kind of a triangle. One point of the triangle is Glen Rowan across the street. Then it fans out to the ends of this row of buildings along here. And that's was originally an open space. And the architecture of Glen Rowan reflects the elements of what you see here. There's red brick, limestone, crenellations that were a Frost and Granger trait. So this building is Frost and Granger, as is the library next door. 1900, the Tiffany windows. Tiffany window you see here, 1902, supplied by Mrs. Reed. You'll see Tiffany fixtures both here and across the street. It's Tiffany things that are the lamps in Glen Rowan. So this is showing an example of Gothic revival, but more collegiate Gothic, obviously, and later Gothic. I guess you'd call this almost perpendicular Gothic, but it was meant to be in that kind of a tradition. So notice it grew over with vines. It used to have vines on everything in Lake Forest, and they disappeared. I think somebody figured out it was costing too much for the tuck pointing, but it made a very evocative setting. This shows the terrace, which is being redone. It's turf down below, but you can't tell, but they're standing on Turkish carpets there. Lillis Barnes over to the right. In the center are Mr. and Mrs. Alfred Carton. This is 1954, a reception in honor of the Bell School in 1954. And you can see them standing for the reception line on these Asian carpets. Now I think this is my last slide, but this just shows that there was a great garden over there at one time. And this feature that went across it, an arbor that went across the lawn to the south and west of the house, is something that we don't know who did it here, but we have a house very much like it in Highland Park that had a similar landscape that was done by O.C. Simons. So there's a suggestion that it could be something that O.C. Simons is. Also, he always liked to have bushes along the sidewalk in the front. And this in earlier pictures Glen Rowan had bushes along the sidewalk in the front. So we haven't talked much about landscape, but by the 20th century, people were getting into more of that. Next slide. Okay, that shows where the garden is, and here are the houses, the Lilacs, Glen Rowan, the Holt House, and Harvey Thompson House. This is just a close-up of how that garden thing is set up, what its relationship to the house is. Okay, even though it was an irregular style outside, it's a central hall plan, Beaux-Arts, right straight from Paris on the inside. It's very symmetrically organized. That's the dining room. Shaw did this in another house in Hyde Park a few years earlier, but I don't think he told the client. It's interesting. It's very much like, it's got pilasters, classical elements in it, Tiffany lamp fixtures. But up here, a frieze is like it's a frieze, but it's wallpaper very much like William Morris's 1860s wallpaper that had trellises with birds sitting on them things and vines interwinding. And so it's a reflection of William Morris, who was part of the arts and crafts movement, which is very much in that house. And this is my last slide. Okay. This is the den, and there's a fireplace over there that is using materials from the outside on the inside, which Morris did at his own house with Philip Webb in 1860. And there are tiles, little Mercer tiles from Pennsylvania outside of Philadelphia that are on the inside, and then they are on the north wall. So if you check out the study fireplace and then you look on the north wall, you'll see the same elements. And this was an arts and crafts kind of way of doing things. The Tudor strapwork, plaster, and stairways, you'll notice that because it's a very Tudor house in those characteristics. So just a few more things to look at. I think they're a wonderful mix of houses, and you're going to see really these two different periods as you go. The first 50 years of architecture in Lake Forest was tremendously dynamic, combined a wide range of things, and this is an unusual opportunity to see these remarkable things all together. Thank you very much. Great. There we go.
So, but thank you very much, Susan and Art. You're always wonderful.